Whiteside counties. And I'm going to be with you to talk about backyard berry production. I will take any questions that anybody has, so you can put them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. So we will go ahead and get started. Our outline for this evening is to kind of cover a little bit about the specifics about what a berry is, some planting information, things we need to think about before we do our site preparation, and then we will tackle pruning, training, all the management stats listed, including harvesting and post-harvest, and we'll do that by plant. So we'll start out with strawberries, go into blueberries, and then we'll end tonight talking about our brambles, so our blackberries and raspberries. What exactly is a berry and a bramble? Well, a berry, botanically speaking, is a fleshy fruit produced from a single ovary. Many fruits that we eat are actually considered berries. So bananas, grapes, pumpkins, tomatoes, blueberries are the only one that we'll talk about today that fits under that definition. Brambles and strawberries are berry-like fruits. So when we talk about blackberries and raspberries, we generally consider them brambles. They both come from a prickly shrub in the genus Rubus, and brambles are aggregate fruits. So again, botanically speaking, they contain seeds that actually come from different ovaries, but the same single flower. It's difficult to beat that flavor of fresh, homegrown fruit. In many cases, small fruits are difficult to find in markets, and if they are available, they tend to be very expensive. Besides, some benefit of growing them is they can be fun to grow, have your own, as well as if you have children, grandchildren, neighborhood folks. It's a good way to get everybody involved and share a common pastime. But there are things that we need to think about when we do our berry planting. Many gardeners out there, myself included, we always think we can do more than reality allows us to. So we have to think about how much time can we actually spend in our garden. We would all love to have a 1,000-square-foot garden, but reality, sometimes maybe we only have 25 minutes a night to work in our garden, which is not a whole lot to do a full garden. We need to think about our site, so it should be fertile and well drained on a moderately elevated or have some kind of slope in there to help us with drainage. It should be a convenient location, good access to water, and if the only place you have in your yard to put a garden that's full sun locationed, well drained, is 500 feet from your house behind a barn, sometimes out of sight, out of mind, you're not going to work at it as much as if it was located near your back porch, near a water spigot, and very convenient to get to. Another thing with convenient location is sometimes if we don't have a large yard or some raised beds that we could do, container gardening is another option that we could think about. We want to choose cultivars that are adapted to our region. So the Midwest region in Illinois, we range from zone 4 at the northern part where I am, all the way down to zone 6 in part of the southern state. And then we also want to make sure that we're getting certified virus stock. This is a good one because we don't want to introduce new problems into our clean site, even though sometimes as gardeners we can't help but resist a good bargain on plants, as well as the last plant on the shelf. We want to make sure to give it a good home, but sometimes it's just good to say no, we need to start fresh and new. So when we talk about site preparation, we want to make sure that we first start off getting our soil tested. This will tell us what nutrients that we're deficient in, as well as give us a base for how much organic matter we need to add prior to planting. The other thing that we need to think about is to avoid sites that have verticillium wilt. Verticillium wilt is a fungal disease that affects over 300 different species. Many of them that are listed on this slide, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, all those are ones that we had previously grown in gardens before. So if you're planning on converting an old garden plot into your new berry patch, it's good to give it about 3 to 5 years, just in case there's been some verticillium wilt in that location, as it was a vegetable garden. Prior to starting our planting, we also want to make sure to remove any sod for a new planting, to allow that to get ready for the next year, as well as a soil test will also tell us the acidity level or pH of our soil. Most of the berries that we'll talk about prefer a range between 5.5 and 7.5, which for Illinois is pretty normal. But when we want to get into blueberries, this is where we can run into a bit of an issue. We have to do a lot of amending. Blueberries prefer a really acidic soil between a 4.8 and a 5.2, and we'll talk about how we can do that amending in further slides. So when we get ready to actually do the planting, we've done all of our planting, we've got our garden ready to go, we want to buy those best plants available. You can get local nursery plants. Generally, you will buy these in the spring if you're buying local. In cases of where you're buying from a national supplier or a fruit distributor that specializes in tissue culture plants, these you'll have to put in an order for early winter, so about November or December. Now, if you do end up purchasing tissue culture plants, they can be more expensive. Now, with tissue culture plants, they are grown in sterile conditions. The plant material that they're grown for has been certified that there's no virus in it. Then it's grown in sterile conditions, and then when you receive it, there's a lot more work that goes into it. So this accounts for that increase in cost. Another thing to make sure to mention when you do purchase your plants is to specify your delivery date. Folks down in the southern part of the state will have an earlier delivery date than I would up here. For the plants that I've been purchasing, I've been having them come this week, just because my frost-free date is right now. So this week is the date in Northwest Illinois when we are, on average, free of frost. How do we choose our cultivars? Well, this is going to depend on what use you're going to need them for. If you're going to use them for fresh consumption, preserving, cooking, these can all require a different cultivar. Nothing worse than freezing your berries and then they can't take the cold temperature, and when you defrost them you get a bag of mush. Another thing to think about is disease resistance and winter hardiness. Winter hardiness, you got to have between a 4, a 5, or a 6, depending on your location in the state. And disease resistance, all of these berries that we're going to talk about, or berry-like fruits, all have something that enjoys them as much as we do. And then another thing to think about is to choose your cultivar based on your harvest period. So in strawberries we'll talk about, they have different mature periods. Some will mature in early June, and there are some varieties that you can get strawberries off of the entire season. This is going to depend on your preference as well as the other choices that you're thinking about. Some potential sources, there are local sources, nurseries, big box stores, where you can get your berry plants. And here are just a couple of national sources that have a good variety of berry plants available. When do we plant our berries and brambles? Typically, we are going to specify for them to be delivered in the spring. We're going to start them and plant them. When you receive them, so this week I would have received mine. If I received them yesterday during that terrible thunderstorm, I wouldn't have been able to get out there and plant them. So I would have needed to put them in a cool storage, like a refrigerator, away from any fruits or vegetables, or putting them into a temporary location where I could keep them moist. If you do receive them and you can plant them right away, what you want to do is, if they're bare root, soak them for a couple of hours prior to planting. What this is going to do is it's going to start to rehydrate that plant, as well as it's been in a dark shipping container or a bag, and it just kind of gives it a chance to breathe a little bit before you put it in the ground. Another good planting technique or tip is that you want to put them in a partly cloudy or a shady day. With them being in those containers, a full sun environment could be too bright for them and give them a little bit of a burn. So we want to go for that shady, early morning or late afternoon if it's going to be a full sun day. And then another key thing is to water regularly during the establishment period. We want to get those roots well in place, because for all of our crops, they are going to be perennial, and some of them are going to be extremely long-lived. So it's good to have that good base. We will start off with strawberries, and strawberries are the most popular small fruit for home gardeners. Just a bit of trivia for you. Their name comes from the traditional practice of mulching the plants with straw for winter protection, and then using that straw to keep the berries clean the following growing season. So we've got a couple of types of strawberries that we can choose from. The two main types are the June bearing, that are one crop in the late spring, usually around June. And this is going to be the one that's going to have the better overall yield. So it's going to put all of its energy into producing those large strawberries once a year. The other type that we have are the everbearing types. And everbearing types and day neutrals are generally put together. They both receive several flushes of flowers and fruit during each season. Now, some of the everbearing types flower and fruit continuously through the growing season, unless it gets too hot, and then they fade out for during that hot period. So how do we select our strawberries? Well, this is going to depend on your personal taste or those personal taste of your family. If there's a strawberry that you grew up eating that you want to try and find again, that's an option. So you're going for your dessert quality, so going for that specific taste, the sugar content, the tartness. The other option is maturity date. And this is where people kind of extend out their season. So they'll plant a June-bearing strawberry, like a honeydew, that will bear fruit in the early part of the season, so early June. And then they might choose a day neutral, like a TriStar, or a Seascape that will extend their harvest throughout the summer. Another option to think about is the preserving quality. So what are you going to do with them? Are you going to eat them fresh? I know in the case of June-bearing strawberries, it's kind of hard to eat all those strawberries at once. So you want to make sure that if you are going to make pie filling or can or freeze them, that they're going to be able to stand up to that. And then the other quality we need to think about is the disease resistance. So as we can see here on the right side of the slide, there are two diseases that are listed. Verticillium wilt is that fungal disease, and then red steel is another disease that affects strawberries and will actually turn the strawberry plants red. In both cases, we can see here that the R's stand for resistant and the S stands for susceptible. So depending on the cultivar you choose. Like if you chose the June bearing early glow, you'll see that it's resistant to both, as well as its regional adaptiveness for Illinois is it can take the northern, the central, or the southern temperatures. But if we look at a strawberry jewel, that's susceptible to both verticillium wilt and red steel. And if you're in the southern part of the state, it wouldn't be able to take your environment. For our site selection for our strawberries, thinking that these are perennial crops that'll come back year after year, we want to make sure that we're growing them well in a garden soil, but we want it to have high soil fertility for the best production. So this is going to mean lots of good organic matter, adding in some compost, fertilizer, or composted manure prior to planting, getting that soil ready, tilling it in, and then putting our plants in, and then a pH of between 5.5 and 6.5. With our strawberries, we can plant them as soon as the ground can be worked in the spring. But one thing we want to make sure of is that the soil is not too wet. If the soil is too wet, then it can lead to some root rot issues as well as fungal issues down the road. Now with our strawberry plants, one thing that we want to make sure to do is to plant it at the proper depth. We want to put that crown right at the soil line. If we plant it too high, it's going to be too shallow, or it's going to be too shallow, so that crown's going to stick out. It's not going to be protected as much. We'll have to add more mulch to the top of it. And if we plant it too deep, then we expose it to a lot of root and crown rot issues with that plant. And again, it's good just to plant them in on a cloudy day or a late afternoon or an evening. Now, there are a couple of different systems that we can use for planting our strawberries. The most popular one for June-bearing strawberries is called the matted row system. Now, with the matted row system, we are going to set our mother plants 18 to 30 inches apart within the row, and then we're going to have a wide row spacing of 3 to 4 feet. Now, for those who might not know with strawberries, they're going to produce daughter plants off of those mother plants. Now, that's why we give them such a wide row spacing, because as we can see in the picture, all these daughter plants around the central plant are going to fill in all of that space that we leave. And then all of these daughter plants have the ability to produce strawberries in the future. Now, daughter plants are produced off of runners, which come out of the central plant. And it's not every node on the strawberry. It's actually every other node of those runners where a daughter plant is produced. With the matted row system, we allow those daughter plants to freely root wherever they touch the soil. Now, differently, is the spaced row system. Now, in the spaced row system, we still use the same in-row spacings and out-of-row spacings, or between the row spacings, but daughter plants are spaced no closer than 4 inches apart. So what we're going to do is we're going to limit the number of daughter plants that are produced. So as you can see here on the right side of the screen, you can see faintly where all of those gray daughter plants have produced. And then for each one of the strawberries, there are 2 daughter plants on the left side and 4 on the right side that are kept. And what this is doing is you are going in and you're cutting off all of those extra runners, so those mother plants and those daughter plants consume those nutrients that would have went into all those other daughter plants. This will also give a better spacing for your strawberries because you're limiting the number. And by limiting the number and controlling where the daughter plants are, you're opening up that strawberry plant to less disease issues because there's more airflow. And by selecting the number of daughter plants, you're going to have larger berries and larger yields. The other option that we have is a hill system. And the hill system is going to be best for the everbearing and day-neutral cultivars. Now with this one, you are only keeping the original strawberry plant that you put in the ground. All those runners that would be produced, you're going to remove. So this is going to put all of that energy that would have went into producing strawberry plants into that mother plant to continually produce flowers and fruit throughout the growing season. Now with these, since we are not having any daughter plants, we're going to plant them closer together. So we are going to have a 1-foot spacing. Now there's no real training for our strawberries, only the specific production system that you are going to grow in. The matted row, the spaced row, and hill system. Now, with the trends that have been coming out, there have been more folks putting their strawberries into pallets, cinder block gardening, and with this, it's similar to another raised bed planting. So you're planting them above the soil. You're not going to be able to count on that hardening geothermal heat that's going to keep your plants warm. So you have to think about, how can I keep my pallet garden or my cinder block garden warm during the winter? You want to make sure that you're placing these in either places where you can store them over winter, so have them next to a shed or in a garage to overwinter, or covering them with more straw, hoping that we get enough snow to insulate those plants and keep them warm. And another option for using strawberries is decorative in your landscape as well. They make a very good ground cover or accent to a base of a tall plant. For their water needs, they need about an inch a week. So with this, one good soaking each week should suffice for most soil types. You want to always make sure that you water early in the day so that the foliage has a chance to dry out before the night. And what this is going to do is it's going to prevent leaf diseases. Another way that we can help reduce diseases is to use drip irrigation so that each plant is getting its water directly at the soil level. And we can also make sure that we're covering with 4 to 6 inches of weed-free mulch to help hold in that water, as well as this will help reduce our weeds throughout the growing season. Fertilizing our strawberries. For our June-bearing strawberries, we want to make sure that they're producing runners before mid-July. If they're not, what we want to do is give them some good compost or some fertilizer that's going to be a nitrogen boost for them. Nitrogen is going to help them produce that good plant growth that we need, as well as make sure that we're not taking nutrients from the crown each time it flowers, fruits, or tries to produce those daughter plants. And then before we plant, we want to make sure, before the spring, when the plants begin to grow, that we're providing more compost and fertilizer to encourage those plants to continue to have good growth and stem off any physiological issues that could show up from malnutrition. Another note that I always just like to point out here, that if you are going to add a manure to any of your food crops, it's a good idea to have it composted 4 to 6 months prior to the harvest of your fruit. What this is going to do is it's going to cut down on the potential for anything to be put on that produce or moved around in your garden when you are harvesting. For the maintenance of our strawberries, we are going to remove our flowers upon planting for 6 weeks. What this is going to do is it's going to have more root and foliage growth for the plant during that establishment phase. And for our June-bearing strawberries, what we need to do is, after our final harvest, starting that second year, we need to renovate our strawberries. Now, for June-bearing strawberries, to renovate them, what this means is you're going to mow off the foliage. So we're going to set our mower 1 inch above the crown, and then we're going to mow off that foliage. Then we'll apply some fertilizer and allow those plants to regrow. Now what pops up from the crown, you'll see, is going to look more lime green in color because that chlorophyll hasn't fully developed yet, but that will change to that dark green color that we know. Another benefit of renovating our June-bearing strawberries is this is going to control the width of our rows down to 6 to 12 inches. For thinning our hill system, we'll remove runners as they appear. And then the matted row system will remove the surplus plants that begin to develop outside of our row widths. We want to make sure that we keep those good row widths, because if not, it's going to be a hard time walking down the rows to pick your strawberries. And then making sure to put that 4 to 6 inches of weed-free frost on, or weed-free mulch or straw in the fall after we've had 2 to 3 frosts to help harden off those plants. So this is a table from the University of Minnesota Extension, and this kind of is one that I really like because it gives me a graphical calendar representation of what I need to do during each month. So I know that in April I'm going to be doing my transplants. If they're dormant or if they're unpotted, I'm going to be waiting till May. And so on and so on. For weed control for not only strawberries, but all of our plants that we talk about today, it's a good idea to make sure that we get the best site preparation before planting. So doing our tilling, removing all the weeds, making sure we get rid of those good, the bad seeds from our weeds. And then during the growing season, either pulling or putting on some applications of different things for pesticides, depending on the annual and perennial weeds that you have. And if you are going to use a pesticide, making sure that you're applying it at the correct stage, and making sure that you follow all listed directions. So when we go to harvest our strawberries, it's best to do it during the cool parts of the day. So we're either going to do it early morning or early afternoon, because this is going to make our strawberries have a better shelf life as well as a better storage life. We don't want to harvest when wet because we can spread foliar fungal diseases around. And we want to harvest them when they're red, firm, flavorful, and free of disease and defects. So one thing we want to make sure is that whenever we harvest our berries, our brambles, and our blueberries, we have a good bucket and a bad bucket. Now with the good bucket and the bad bucket, we're going to be removing all that spent, diseased fruit, so it doesn't rot in our fields, causing potential for disease issues later on, or bringing in any insects that could be harmful to our fruit as well. It's just a good idea to always make sure that you don't get the two buckets mixed up. Now I have on here that harvest crew training is critical. For anybody who is going to be selling their fruit at a farmer's market or going to be doing it for a business, commercially, grading, sizing, and packaging is done in the field. So as you're harvesting off those strawberries, you're putting them into different pint containers to go ready so that you're not taking extra time later on. Another thing to remember is that sugar content does not increase after harvest, so therefore it's another reason to harvest when fully mature or ripe. Now for the post-harvest, all of the berries that we talk about are extremely perishable. So temperature management is going to be key. Harvesting at those cool periods and then getting them into cool conditions for storage. Now, on all of the post-harvest slides that I'm going to share with you tonight, these are specific for each crop. Now, I don't know many people who keep their refrigerator at 32 degrees. I'm sure there are a few. So our refrigerators are a combination of temperatures. So we're keeping it at the most safe temperature for all of our fruits, all of our vegetables, produce, meats, cheeses. So 32 degrees for strawberries is going to get you the longest life, but because of that compromise that we have, it's going to change the longevity that you can keep your fruit. Now, for the relative humidity, that's the 90 to 95% RH. That is meaning storing it in your crisper drawer. So crisper drawers in refrigerators have the ability to manage how much humidity is in there. So storing like-minded vegetables together for their relative humidity. Now, I always have to point this out to folks that disease is actually the greatest cause to post-harvest loss. Most people think that it's just wasteful fruit that we just throw away, but it's actually because of that disease that we're throwing it away. All right, on to strawberries. Or blueberries, excuse me. We just talked about strawberries. Blueberries are not commonly grown commercially in Illinois because our soils aren't meeting those requirements that blueberries need, specifically that acidity requirement. There are 3 types of blueberries that are grown in the United States. Low bush and rabbit eye are blueberries that are not grown in Illinois, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on those. High bush are the ones that are primarily grown in Illinois. All of the varieties listed on the right are types of high bush blueberries recommended for Illinois. The soil requirements and site-specific requirements for blueberries are a full sun location with well-drained soil, and a key critical factor for blueberries is uniform moisture. Now, blueberries are very shallow rooted. They have a fibrous root system that is only in the top 18 inches of the soil. So it's going to be very important to have good moisture for them, as well as consistent, constant moisture results in 18% larger blueberries than those that don't receive consistent or constant moisture. Now, the thing that most people have to do is acidify their soil. Now, when we talk about acidifying your soil, there are a couple of things to do. When we start off with our blueberries, we are going to dig a hole. Now, we're going to add sphagnum peat moss to our soil. When we do this, we're going to get our peat moss and we are going to moisten it the night before and leave it sit overnight. Then, when we're getting ready to plant, we're going to dig our hole and then we're going to put our blueberry plant in, and we're going to backfill that hole with 50% peat moss and 50% of the soil that we took out. What this is going to do is it's going to add the peat moss in there for not only acidifying the soil, but it's going to hold in more moisture for you. Then going forward, when we fertilize, we'll be adding sulfur in there to keep up our moisture. Now, when we don't have a pH that's high enough for blueberries, this is what happens. We get blueberry chlorosis. Now, what that means is that the soil is not acidic enough that the blueberry cannot take up the iron that it needs. So as it's producing those blueberries and those flowers, what's happening is that the blueberry is not going to be producing chlorophyll, so we get that iron chlorosis. For our blueberry blossoms, we need to have at least 2 varieties for better pollination and higher yields. Now, during the first 2 years, we're going to be removing the flowers. So we're going to be sacrificing the first 2 years of blueberry production. But what's going to happen is all of that energy is going to be put into vegetative growth for that blueberry. And it is going to produce a good root system and get the shoots and good structure formation that it's going to need for blueberries. Especially because blueberries are one of those longer-lived fruit plants that we grow. Now when we get ready to plant, we dug our hole, we got ready to backfill with our peat moss and our soil mixture. We're going to make sure that we're spreading the roots out evenly. And if you're receiving your blueberry from a pot, you're going to plant it at the same depth that it was in the pot. Another thing that we want to do is that if our site location doesn't have the best drainage, as you can see on the right side of the slide, these blueberries are planted on a berm. And what these berms do is help ensure good water drainage. So for a berm, they're going to typically be about 6 to 8 inches high and 2 to 3 feet wide and extend down the plant row. What this is going to do is when we get heavy rainwater, like we did just last night, all that water is going to drain away from the blueberries. Now, so this makes it so our blueberries aren't sitting in moisture, but that berm's going to draw in that water as it needs it. So after we get our plants in the ground, ready to go, we are going to firm them in. So just pressing on the soil, making sure that's good and firm. And then each blueberry bush is going to need approximately 2 gallons of water to be thoroughly watered in. And then we're going to apply about 2 to 3 inches of either straw, corn stalks, wood chips, or leaves as a mulch. Now, with our mulch, we want to make sure that we don't include any cedar or black walnut. So now it's 4 weeks later after we've done our planting, and we're going to fertilize. So we're going to apply 1 ounce of ammonium sulfate in a circular 12 to 18 inch base around the plant. What this is going to do is it's going to encourage those roots to grow out, and we're not going to put the fertilizer right on those developing roots. The ammonium sulfate is going to help provide the nutrient or the nitrogen that our blueberries need, as well as acidify the soil. Now, one thing to just point out, when you go to the store to buy ammonium sulfate, make sure that you don't buy aluminum sulfate. They're two completely different products. Now, when we continue to fertilize each year, we're going to increase the number of, or the amount of fertilizer by 1 ounce until we reach 8 ounces total. And then after that point, we're just going to continually, on an annual basis, to give them 8 ounces of ammonium sulfate fertilizer. Now, from year 2 on, you're going to apply your fertilizer in the spring. So pruning and training for our blueberries, we're not going to need a trellis. What we are going to need to do for our blueberries is to maintain a very good pruning system. And we're going to talk about that after we talk about irrigation. So like I said, constant, consistent moisture throughout the growing season. Blueberries do not have as many foliar diseases as strawberries do, so we can use overhead or sprinkler irrigation if we don't want to put a drip line in. The thing that we do not want to see on our blueberries is we don't want to see reddened foliage, wilting, browning leaf margins, thin or weak shoots, early defoliation, or decreased fruit set. If we see these, what that means is we've either overwatered or we've underwatered. So this is going to be a little bit of a trial and error, making sure that we get that good soak on them every week with blueberries. Again, about 1 inch a week. All right, for our pruning, for new plantings, what we're going to do is the first 2 years we're going to remove any diseased cane or diseased branches as they form, and we're going to remove any flower buds. So we want to keep that plant vegetative all year. Now, because fruit is produced on 2 to 4 year old canes, this is going to be where the primary amount of fruiting wood is going to be. So the ideal structure for your berry bush is to have 20% of your canes in year 1, 20% in year 2, 20 in year 3, 20 in year 4, and 20 in 5+ wood. Now what this is going to do is it's going to allow those canes in year 1 to become fruiting wood or take the place of any other wood that you might have to take out. and keep it in a good balance. So those older canes are not going to produce as much fruit, but they're going to be the ones that have the most leaves on them. They're going to be a little bit thicker so they can take the winter or the wind and have those good leaves on them. Now, how can you tell what is young wood and what is older wood on a blueberry? The best way to tell is the size and diameter. So the smaller the wood, the younger it's going to be. When it gets older, it's going to increase in size, as well as it'll be more rigid and brown. The wood will be more browner than greener. Now, with the mature canes that we're going to be taking out, when they reach 5 years, at the end of that 5th year, we will remove them back to the ground and then allow new 1-year-old growth to form the next year to continue that cycle. Now, for established plants, if it is severely overgrown, sometimes it's easier to cut the entire plant back to the ground and start all over. For winter protection, winter injury happens when it gets really cold. In most cases, we have enough snowfall that we don't have to worry about winter protection. Now, in recent years, we haven't had as much snow as we would have, or I would have liked. So other winter protection strategies we can think of are planting our blueberries behind a windbreak, increasing the amount of mulch that we have to make sure that we're making good coverage around that crown, or putting row covers or netting over there to help collect the snow over the fruiting wood. Again, with weed control, the thing that varies here is the blueberries are very shallow. So the top 18 inches, weed control, I'm going to recommend that you don't do as much hand cultivation as you might with some of the others. This one would be more pulling them out or using an herbicide at the correct stage of weed growth. Harvesting our blueberries can be a tricky thing. As we can see in the picture, not all of our blueberries on the cluster will ripe at the same time. So we can see the firm blue ones pictured by the hand. Those are the ones we're going to take off and allow the reddish purple ones to continue to develop. Ideally, we're going to have our fruit picked and all the way into the refrigerator within an hour for the longest shelf life. Now, if you are going to do a larger planting of blueberries that might require some mechanical harvesting, there are those options out there, but mechanical harvesting can reduce the shelf life and storage life of blueberries up to half compared to hand picking. So for post-harvest of blueberries, again, we want them as close to freezing as possible, but these can be stored up to 2 weeks. One thing that we need to make sure is that we're not storing it with an ethylene-producing fruit or vegetable. So no apples, no pears, no peaches, no melons, no grapes. What ethylene is going to do, ethylene is the ripening hormone that is produced by fruits. And on our berries and our brambles, it causes gray mold to be developed quicker. All right, for our brambles, we're going to do something a little differently. We're going to talk about the information that applies to both blackberries and raspberries, and then we'll talk about some information that only applies to one or the other. So our brambles are our raspberries, blackberries in the genus Rubus. Now, raspberries can be red, black, gold. Now, how to tell the difference between a blackberry and a black raspberry is a black raspberry will be hollow. It won't have that receptacle in the very center. It'll look like a red raspberry, but it'll be black. Now for our red raspberry, Latham and Titan are popular cultivars of summer-bearing red raspberries, adapted to Illinois. Heritage and Ruby are ever-bearing types of red raspberries that do well in Illinois. And red raspberries send up shoots from their roots up to several feet away from the mother cane. So they do spread rapidly, and in most cases will form what we call a hedgerow. Now our purple raspberries are a cross between red and black raspberries. Now, Brandywine and Royalty are two common cultivars, but there's a difference between the two. Brandywine has a half black, half red parentage with a plant habit similar to black raspberries. So Brandywine would be treated as a black raspberry. Now Royalty has a 1/4 black and 3/4 red parentage. Thus it grows and we treat it like a red raspberry. Now for our yellow raspberries, Goldie is an ever-bearing type of red raspberry. Or yellow raspberry, excuse me. Yellow raspberries are grown just like red raspberries. And most folks in the fruit industry, since they grow so well, think that it was just a mutation that caused yellow raspberries to lose their red pigments. For planting of our raspberries, what we're going to typically do is plant 1-year-old canes, and they're going to be planted in early spring. Now, we are going to water them in well, and depending on the source, so if you receive your raspberries and brambles, and they are conventionally propagated, so they're not done by tissue culture, you're going to prune them to about 10 to 12 inches. Now, if they're done in tissue culture, they don't need to be pruned because they are ready to go. Now, for our planting, red and yellow raspberries spread by root suckers. So they're going to form a hedgerow. Now, our black and purple raspberries do not spread by root sucker, so they're going to form hills. Now this slide talks about mulching of raspberries, and as we can see, depending on the mulch that was used, it shows a little variation in their development. So the bark, straw, and fabric mulches, all you can see form grew better, had more produce, and larger berries. Now for no mulch and no weed control, you can see that we have more sickly looking plants. Now for our raspberries, there are two types of raspberries that we can have. We can have summer bearing and ever bearing. Now for our summer bearing, it's going to have 1-year-old berries on, or one crop of berry on 2-year-old canes early to midsummer. So summer bearing raspberries, you'll hear me call floricane raspberries. Floricanes are the 2-year-old canes. Now, depending on your type of raspberry, this is where it takes a little bit of knowing, because depending on the type of raspberry you have, summer bearing or ever bearing, it's going to affect how you prune and take care of your berry. So our summer bearing are going to be our floricane, and then our ever bearing are also referred to as primicane berries. Primicane means first year wood. So on summer bearing, they're floricane. The first year, they have vegetative growth. The canes overwinter, and then those canes become floricanes and produce fruit. On everbearing or primicane raspberries, they produce fruit on first year wood. Now, primicane raspberries, if you let them overwinter, will produce a second crop of raspberries on everything below the tip of the raspberry, because they'll fruit that first year on the tips of the cane, and then the second year they will fruit on everything else. Now that second crop isn't going to be as abundant, or it's going to be a smaller crop. So most people tend to not worry about it. And I'll tell you why when we talk about pruning. So for blackberries, there are multiple types that we can have: erect, semi-erect, trailing, thorny, and thornless. And there are going to be variations on those 5 themes. Our erect, thorny blackberries are generally more hardy and more flavorful than the thornless types. The spiny canes grow vegetatively the first year and then produce fruit and die the second year. Now, one of the cultivars that is recommended is Illini Hardy, which is a cultivar that was developed at the University of Illinois and does well in the northern cold climate. The semi-erect thornless type of blackberry does need some support or trellis for proper growth. As you can see here in the picture, these canes are tied to a 3-wire trellis. The thornless canes make harvest a less painful task Fruits of the thornless type are often larger, but less intensely flavored than the thorny varieties. New shoots of trellising types of blackberries should not be pinched or pruned in the late season, since they are more subject to winter dieback when they are pruned late. So, when we get ready to do our planting, we're going to plant them early spring, and then if they are conventionally propagated, we're going to cut them back to 6 inches at planting. Again, tissue culture does not need to be done on our tissue culture blackberries do not need pruning, and the mulching and cultivation is similar to raspberries. Irrigation, we're going to water thoroughly after planting, and again maintaining that good soil moisture. One thing we want to make sure not to do is to water every day. If we water every day, that opens our blackberries up to some disease issues, but 1 to 2 inches of good rainfall or watering a week will make our blackberries very happy. So for trellising and pruning of our brambles, it's going to be essential for maintaining quality and productivity over the long term. As we can see by the bottom of the slide, proper trellising and pruning affects growth rate, frequency, size, fruit size and quantity, the sugar content, as well as reduces the amount of disease that we can have, and makes our labor very easy to perform when harvesting and spraying. Now, for trellising and pruning of our brambles, this is where it kind of depends on what type of bramble you have. For our thornless blackberries, we'll start up here on diagram 2, so the left top. You can see that the thornless blackberries have been tied to the trellis wire, and on the left side, this is what they look like after they went through their dormant, or before they went through their dormant season pruning. So they've grown, they've got attached to the wire, and then when we do our pruning in the early spring, what we're going to do in that dormant season before they start actively growing, we're going to go through and select our best canes, generally about 3 to 5 per square foot, and we're going to keep those and get rid of the rest. Now, we'll start by removing any diseased or dying canes first, and then we'll keep the rest and make sure that we secure them to the trellis wire. Now, on diagram 1, our black and purple raspberries, these are going to be the ones that are in our hill system. So they didn't form that hedgerow, but the canes have been coming up. So again, we're going to keep our best 3 to 5, and we're going to prune the rest down to the ground, removing diseased and dying first, or any that look like they have winter injury. And then we are also going to cut them back. And we'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. Now, diagram 3, these are our red raspberries that form the hedgerow. So you can see that before we do our dormant season pruning, they have overgrown outside of our 18 to 24 inch width, and they've really filled in. So now, again, we're going to pick our strongest canes, but this time we're going to do our best 2 to 3 per square foot going down the row. And for this one, we're not only taking down our diseased and dying, but we're taking any that are outside that 18 to 24 inches. We want to reestablish our walkways and our rows, otherwise our raspberry patch is going to grow in on itself. Now this is the chart that I like the best for pruning. Now you can see at the top it says red raspberries, and at the bottom it also says red raspberries. Well, the ones at the top, those are going to be our floricane, or our second year fruiting red raspberries. So starting in year 1, we're going to do our planting in early spring when we can get into the ground. We're going to let them freely grow throughout the first year. In the dormant part of year 2, so January through March, we're going to come in and we're going to prune only winter kill tips, and then we're also going to thin them down to that 3 to 5 per square foot. We're going to allow them to harvest or grow their fruit, and then we'll harvest them in the summer. And then in the September, October, November, we are going to go in and remove only the fruiting canes after harvest. Now remember, with our red raspberries and our black and purple raspberries, we are also going to have primicanes, or vegetative growth, growing each year. So we're going to have a mix of our primicanes and our floricanes. After the floricanes have gone through their growth, produced their fruit, we're going to get rid of those. Our primicanes are then going to overwinter and become our floricanes, and our new primicanes are going to grow during that season. With our black and purple raspberries, we're going to plant them, and then we're going to come in here in the summer and we're going to tip them. Now what tipping is going to do is that is going to make sure that they don't get too floppy. Tipping them is going to give them some rigidity, as well as it's going to allow the buds on the outside of those stems to start to grow. Then we allow them to grow, and then the next year, during January through our dormant period, we are going to do our dormant pruning and thinning. We'll harvest in the summer, and then again we'll remove all of our fruiting. Now with our everbearing, or our primicane raspberries, you remember hearing me say that these were my favorite. They're my favorite because what we do is we plant them, allow them to grow, and then in the fall we get our raspberries. Now where it becomes my favorite is after we've done our fall harvest, we can go out there, set our mower to 1 inch above the crown, and mow them off. What this is going to do is it's going to take care of all of this pruning, and it's going to cut them back to the ground. They will regrow again in March and April, so we don't have to go out there and do our dormant season pruning. And then they'll regrow spring through summer, and in fall again we'll get to harvest them, and again we will get to mow them off and continue the cycle all over again. Now, trellising and pruning for our brambles. We're going to talk about some trellises and give some examples. So for our summer raspberry trellises, we can put these on a T trellis that's set at 3 feet high, with the option to expand on that trellis if our brambles really do have some productive growth. Now, again, for our trellis wires on these diagrams, these are set for a standard height of somebody probably between 5, 7, and 6 feet. Now, if you are shorter, you might set your trellis wires lower so that when you reach to work on that top wire, it's not going to be you on your tippy toes or having to stand on a ladder, so it creates an unsafe environment for you. So you can alter your trellis wires as needed. For our black raspberries and blackberry trellis, this is going to be a 4-wire trellis with the wire set at 2.5 feet all the way up to 5.5 feet. For our maintenance the first year, we're only going to cultivate deep enough to destroy any weeds, and we're going to make sure that we have 6 to 8 inches of mulch so that we can suppress the weeds. For our weed control, again, we've got that good mulch in there. We don't have to do as much weeding, which saves us in the long run. Now, you want to make sure that you are controlling those. So for our blackberry specific information, we are going to fertilize early spring when growth starts, and then again just after harvest. Now what we're going to do is we're going to apply a balanced fertilizer. So if you can't find a 10-10-10, you can use another balanced fertilizer like a 13-13-13. Now during year 1 and 2, we're going to be doing just like our fertilizer applications on our blueberries. We're going to be putting a 12-inch circle fertilizer around the plant. Once we get to 3-year-old or older, then we can just do broadcast fertilizer applications down the row. Harvesting, again, being a perishable fruit, they're easily damaged. We're going to harvest them when the fruit color, when they've got their good fruit color, they've got a glossy appeal to them, and ease of detachment. So ripe berries, you should just be able to pull them off and they'll come right off. Now they will lose their acidity while ripening, but to remember that those that are only partially covered will be very astringent and might not taste the best. We want to store them as close to 32 degrees with relative humidity of about 90% and can be stored for up to 2 weeks. One thing to note here is that 1 day at room temperature will rapidly increase the amount of gray mold growth. So leaving them at room temperature causes them to go to waste faster. Again, we want to make sure that we are keeping them away from ethylene producing fruits for the gray mold, and for our raspberries, they are going to be heavy feeders. so they need to be fertilized. These we can do in a broadcast fertilizer, so just go down the row. And we are going to fertilize them in the spring before growth begins, and then again in May when that fruit is developing. And again, we're going to apply a balanced fertilizer for them. For harvesting, raspberries are the most fragile and perishable of all fruits, so they're very quick to decay. For their maturity, we are looking for a good solid fruit color and ease of detachment. The best way to make sure that your berries are ready to come off is you can lightly go up and shake the bush or shake your canes, and those raspberries will fall right off. Now, there is a typo here on the screen, so after picking, cool them. That's supposed to say 32 degrees Fahrenheit within 12 hours. We don't want to freeze our berries. We want to make sure to get them close to 32 as we can. So just change that 12 to 32. Now, compared to all of our other berries that we've talked about, raspberries can only be stored 2 to 5 days cultivar depending. That's because they're extremely perishable. Now, similar to our brambles, or our blackberries, excuse me, 1 day at room temperature is going to increase your gray mold as well as ethylene production as well. And with that, here's what we talked about. So we talked about strawberries, blueberries, and brambles. A little bit about their planting, training, and maintenance, and their harvesting. Here is my contact information. Should anybody have any questions as they are working with their berry plants, run into an issue or need some advice, please feel free to email me. I'm out of the office, in and out, so email usually works best. Please feel free to visit go.illinois.edu/4seasonsrecordings to view all of the other past recordings of the 4 Seasons Gardening webinar series available on YouTube. And with that, I will open it up to see if we've got some questions here. If you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box.